Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Sonia Faleiro to discuss The Good Girls, An Ordinary Killing, published by our friends at Grove Press. Sonia Faleiro is the author of Beautiful Thing Inside the Secret World of Bombay's Dance Bars, which was named a Book of the Year by The Guardian, The Observer, The Sunday Times, NPR, and The Economist, and a novella, The Girl. She is a co-founder of DECA, a cooperative of award-winning writers creating narrative journalism about the world. She lives in London, from where she joins us today. To moderate this afternoon's conversation, we're joined by Isaac Chotiner. Isaac is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he is the principal contributor to Q&A, a series of interviews with major public figures in politics, media, books, business, technology, and more. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And you can order your copy of The Good Girls from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hi, Sonia.
Hey, how are you?
Good, thank you. Hi, Isaac.
Hi.
There you go.
Sonia, thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm very excited to talk about The Good Girls, An Ordinary Killing, which is a fantastic, incredibly reported book that I had the pleasure to read and that I hope everyone gets a chance to pick up. It is about, I'll just briefly say, the death of two young women, aged 16 and 14, named Padma and Lali. These are the names Sonia gave them, the pseudonyms, and she can talk more about that. In Uttar Pradesh, a northern Indian state, in May 2014, a little over almost 7 years ago. And so to start, I just want to, give people some background on the book. But I think the way I'll do that is to first ask Sonia about how she came across this story. She mentions in the book that she had been reading about the Delhi rape case, which was now infamous rape in New Delhi in 2012, and decided to set out on a story that would talk about how women are being treated in India, and then eventually found her way to this story. So Sonia, how did you come across this story, and why did you decide to end up writing about it, even though it's a little bit different than the case you were at first transfixed by?
Yeah. Hey, Isaac, and hey, everyone at Books and Books and the Miami Book Fair, and anybody who's listening. Thank you so much for being here. I was kind of recovering from the 2012 Delhi bus rape, in the sense that, it was an incredibly traumatic event just to read about. Because I think that, as with a lot of Indian women, it felt like, that could have been me, that it was in a way a close call. I had grown up in Delhi, grown up expecting assault. And, when that case happened, suddenly the conversation, it completely changed, right? We had never talked about sexual assault in India, and suddenly that's all we could talk about. And it seemed that a part of that was reporting and reading about sexual assault all the time. So at some point it felt like, there were crimes against women happening daily, and they weren't being investigated, and nobody was being caught, and the crimes were just being repeated. And so what I wanted to do, because I was just as baffled as anybody else about the situation, was to write a book about sexual assault. And while I was thinking about what shape this book might take, I happened to be on Twitter one day in 2014 and saw a picture of two children who I call Padma and Lali because I can't legally name them under Indian law. And they were hanging from a tree in a village in Uttar Pradesh. And the rumor that was circulating on Twitter was that the children had gone out to use the fields because they didn't have a toilet at home. And they had then been abducted by dominant caste men and raped and then hanged on that tree in their own village as a show of power and strength. And, the fact that they were kids, the fact that this had happened in this very close-knit community was even more disturbing to me than the other crimes that I had been looking at. And so I decided that I would go to Katra Sadatganj, the village where the children were from, and try and understand what had happened to them as a way of trying to understand what was happening to women in general. And what ended up happening was that after a week of being in Katra, it became clear that the story I had heard was not actually what had happened in the fields that night. And that's why I ended up staying staying with this particular story. And so a book about sexual violence in India became a book about a crime against two kids in a village in India.
Yeah, I mean, the book, by the end of the book, I would say it functions as sort of a critique of so many different aspects of Indian society today: politics, media, law enforcement, different caste issues, healthcare and sanitation. When do you feel like you got the sense that this case, as well as sort of touching on these gender issues that you were thinking about, would sort of touch on all these different areas of Indian society that you could sort of shine a light on?
So originally, it became a conversation about the fact that the kids had gone out at night because they didn't have a toilet, right? And so it became a story about sanitation. Then, because it was said that the children had been abducted by dominant caste men, it became a story about caste. And then when the politicians started showing up in the fields in the village and doling out money to the girls' families, then it became a story about, how political incompetence and the tawdriness of Indian politicians who sort of descend on these crime scenes in their incredibly fancy helicopters and literally give out cash to people and then, promise change, but then just disappear, never to be seen again. But it was, I think, maybe 2, even 3 years after I was, going between London and Katra, that I heard about this man in the village. His name is Rajiv Kumar. He shows up at the very beginning of the book. And Rajiv Kumar, like a lot of people in the village, had 2 jobs, right? Everybody hustles because it's so hard to make money. And so one of his jobs, his main job, was farming because he had a tiny plot of land, but he was also a government teacher. And while he was farming one day, he saw Padma and Lali talking on the phone. And Rajiv Kumar didn't know Padma and Lali. He didn't know their parents. He wasn't friends with them. But something about the girls talking on the phone, it really sort of triggered something in him, and he didn't like what he saw. And he took it upon himself to go and complain about them to an uncle of theirs, a young man actually in his 20s, who goes on to become, the unreliable narrator of the case. His name is Nazru. And Rajiv Kumar tells Nazru, look, I saw the girls in your family talking on a phone, and you should fix this because this is going to be a problem. They're up to no good. And so from that, that sort of kickstarts all the events that take place and then culminate in the death of the girls. So actually what the story is about, it's about privacy, it's about surveillance, it's about how we surveil girls' lives and how we don't allow them any privacy, really, and what we think a girl's place is, and the sense of ownership that even completely random men have over girls simply because they belong to their community. So I think then that's what the story ultimately is. In a way, it's like, who does a girl belong to? And in India, the question is, she seems to belong to everybody but herself.
I just want to tell people that, after about a half hour, we're going to turn to questions. And so you can ask a question in the bottom right, and I will read some of hopefully the best ones. Let me just follow up on something you said, which is that especially for American viewers of this, cell phones have been written about in India a lot as something that would change Indian life, and in many cases have changed Indian life. In the last decade or so, there have been books written about this, some really good books written about it. But what role did cell phones play in Katra that you're talking about? Can you talk a little bit about more about that and how it sort of changed life there, but also not changed life there? I think that would be interesting.
Yeah. So if you go to Katra, which is about 6 hours outside Delhi, you're going to find this very close-knit community of about 1,000 families, and they live around the fields where they all work. And they don't, a lot of them, most of them, I would say, don't have power. They use solar panels, and virtually none of them at the time of this incident had toilets. But every family has a mobile phone. In fact, they have many mobile phones, because mobile phones, even in a place like Katra, are extremely cheap. They're just a few hundred rupees, very affordable even for the farmers. And this was before, the cheap data boom, right? So people didn't have the kind of access to data that they had a couple of years after that. But everybody had phones, and Padma and Lalli, in fact, had access to 4 phones because they lived in a joint family with about 18 other people. Now, there's this unspoken rule in the village, which was that girls could use phones, but they were not allowed to own them, because the fear was that a girl who owns a phone, who has a phone that she can use at night or when she's alone, is up to no good. But really, what it was that the men in the village were afraid that women would, have access to this sort of modern gadget would lead to modern ideas and different ways of living, which in India translates into falling in love and deciding who you want to marry, as opposed to waiting for your parents to tell you who you ought to marry. So Padma and Lalli had phones, had access to phones, and unlike their mothers who couldn't read and write, they knew how to use them. So they knew how to make calls and how to receive texts. But shortly before Padma died, she was given a phone of her own. And that is the phone that she carried around with her. Ostensibly, it was given to her because she went out at night to use the fields, and there are cobras in the fields, and bandits show up to steal produce and motorbikes, and also sometimes to take girls. So that was supposed to be supposed to offer her a measure of protection and security. But it turns out that what it really did was allow people to keep tabs on her. So this sort of gadget that is so freeing for people in so many other parts of the world opens up the whole world for them. In Katra, it became a way to make the lives of girls and women even smaller and to control them even more.
Can you talk a little bit about the 2 girls and how you sort of reconstructed aspects of their lives? And just the book has very vivid kind of understanding and description of who they were and how you were able to kind of piece their lives together, and just details about them.
Yeah. So they were teenagers. And so they were at that stage in their life where, their parents knew them as they had been, and they thought they knew them. They sort of imagined what their immediate future was like, because Padma at 16 had been taken out of school and she was about to get married. They were going to marry her off. And Lalli was also going to be married off, which meant that her life would follow the same trajectory as that of her mother's and her grandmother's and, the women before them. So their parents knew who they were and who they would become, because there is just one thing for women to become, but they didn't actually know them as teenagers. They thought they knew them, but they didn't. And that's not really surprising, right? Because a lot of parents don't know their teenagers. And part of being that particular age is kind of being evasive, and not even spending that much time with your parents, because you're trying to create your own identity and develop your own circle. And Padma and Lalli were no different. So, if I asked Padma and Lalli's parents what their kids were like, one of the things they would say to me was that they loved school and they wanted to be doctors. And that's actually a very heartbreaking thing for them to say, because what they were actually trying to say, because of the value that Indians place on education and on becoming, a doctor or an engineer, was that, look, our children deserved to be valued. Our children were valuable. But in fact, Padma and Lali didn't particularly like school, and neither of them wanted to become doctors, So to figure out who they were, I just did what I think any reporter would do when they were dealing with somebody in that age group, which is talk to their friends and talk to people, the people that they actually did hang around with every day while they were doing all the many chores that they were made to do. And as it so happens, in the last week of their death, there was a third girl present in the house, a 12-year-old who'd come to visit them, a cousin of theirs, and she followed them around. And they obviously didn't want her tagging along. But because she was curious and she wanted to be like them, she spied on them. And then she was able to see a side of them that their parents didn't see. One of them loved applying a little bit of makeup, and the other one wrote poetry. And they were always sneaking off to talk on their phones. So it was by talking to their peers more than their parents that I was able to get a sense of who they were.
So Padma and Lali were discovered in May 2014, hanging from a mango tree. And almost immediately after this happened, the story became huge in India. And I was wondering, your book doesn't sort of say so directly, perhaps, but it functions a bit as a critique of the media environment around their deaths and the Indian media generally. And so I was wondering, just to talk about why you think their story became so big and the ways in which the media coverage of the story distorted it.
Yeah, so there is intense competition in the media landscape in India, and quite early on, certain media stations looked to America, particularly to Fox News, to try and figure out how best to distinguish themselves from the fray. So you started seeing a lot of the stuff that you see on Fox, in the way that the female news anchors were dressed, in the fact that the tone was very aggressive, the noise was very loud. There was no such thing as a discussion anymore, so much as just like a bun fight. At any one point you would have a discussion with something between 8 and 12 people, all just shouting over each other and being incredibly provocative. So the idea was that if you want to stand out, you have to provoke. And when the children were discovered in the fields, nobody was interested in covering the story, because it is not an uncommon story in that part of the country. In fact, in the days after Padma and Lali were found, there were several very similar incidents in the area around of women who were found hanging from trees. And what distinguished the story was not so much that they were children. It was the fact that the parents refused to let the children's bodies be removed from the tree. And because the parents refused, and they stood up to the police, who showed up and said, look, we have to perform an autopsy, because it was the promise of a spectacle that the media became interested. So it wasn't that it was a possible sexual assault, or that it was clearly a tragic event, or that they were children. It was that it was a spectacle. And when the media showed up, and this is, I don't want to say everybody was like that, because they obviously weren't. There were many very responsible journalists present, but when the media showed up, they tramped all over the alleged crime scene. There was a lot of pushing. There was a lot of shoving. There was no sort of feeling that you had arrived at the scene of something tragic, and that you were dealing with the parents of dead children. And the parents of Padma and Lali were eager to be on TV, because they felt that if they went on TV, then they would be able to, their fight for justice would receive attention. But the way they were treated, the way that they were sort of pushed and pulled, and the questions that they were asked suggests that what many of the media channels were really looking for was more sensation. So on top of this spectacle that had brought them, they wanted more and more sensation. And so in that pursuit for sensation, they got a few quite vital facts wrong. Calling the children Dalit, for example, which they weren't, or getting the caste of the policeman wrong, which may not seem like a big thing, but it is a huge thing in India, because it can suggest criminal behavior on the part of the people who are being mischaracterized. And so what you saw was some people reporting and a lot of other people just participating in what eventually became a carnival-like atmosphere.
You talk a lot about things like autopsies and the way the police investigation was conducted. Can you talk a little bit about the way that law enforcement screwed this case up and made it more difficult to get to the truth of what happened?
Yeah, I think it started right at the very beginning when the children went missing, and the parents, for reasons of their own that I discuss in the book, refused to go to the police and thought, well, we'll just find them. And then the hours accumulated, and they insisted on searching for them themselves until it became perfectly clear that they were not getting anywhere. And then they went to the police chowki, which is the outpost in the village, which has 5 police officers and is about 5 minutes away from the girl's house. And so you would think, well, 5 police officers in a village the size of Katra is pretty good. But actually, Katra was one of about 30 villages that the police officers were supposed to look after. And they were supposed to do this without any resources. They didn't have phones. They didn't have technology, of course, is out of the question. They didn't have vehicles. They felt that they had been abandoned in this, God-forsaken place. And their response was to abandon responsibility. So they would spend a lot of the time with their feet up and, sometimes drink on duty, often sleep on duty. So when the parents went to the police chowki, they found 5 sleeping policemen who were extremely reluctant to look for the girls. And that sort of reluctance to do their job stemmed from a sense that, look, how do I do my job? I don't know. And even if I can do my job, I'm not going to have anybody support me. And eventually, anyway, this whole investigation will fall apart. So I'm not even going to bother. And it just essentially continued from there. And once the children were found, the police didn't protect the crime scene. They just allowed first dozens and then hundreds of people to come close to the girls, to gawk at them, to take pictures of them. They threw their cigarette butts. Later that night, they used the fields as they do as a toilet. And so the crime scene was not really a crime scene at all. In the sense that nothing was preserved, right? Perhaps things were taken, certainly things were added to the scene. And then finally, when the bodies come down late in the afternoon, they are taken into town for an autopsy by a man who is described in the investigation files as a sweeper who works with a butcher's knife. And I found that description so bizarre that when I was in Katra, I asked permission to watch this man. His name is Lala Ram. I asked permission to watch him conduct an autopsy. And he is a sweeper, and he does use butcher's knives, and he's not alone in that, because of this sense that a lot of people have in India that touching a body is unclean and it makes you impure. You shouldn't touch a dead body. And so a lot of doctors refuse to do that. And that leaves nobody, in many cases, to examine bodies. And then somebody like Lala Ram shows up with a sweeper or with a broom and is told, well, Lala Ram, you do this job. So he was literally a sweeper in the hospital who was told to examine bodies. And there were no medical instruments. Not that he would have known what to do with them, but there weren't, because the hospital couldn't afford them. So he bought his quote unquote medical instruments from the bazaar, from a vegetable vendor. And with those instruments, he examined these children. And you have to keep in mind that this was by the evening when the bodies were being examined, an incredibly high profile case. Everybody in the country who had access to a TV or the internet knew about this case. So this was the level of attention that a high profile case was given. This was the best attention that the kids could get. And yet this was the level at which it was.
We're going to turn to questions in a couple minutes, but I wanted to ask, I don't want to sort of reveal all the different things you discovered about this case. There's some just incredible reporting and a lot of sort of surprises about things that you found. But one of the things you do say, you sort of refer back to the Delhi rape case and similar cases. And you say about this case near the end of the book, and I don't think I'm giving anything away, that it revealed something more terrible still, that an Indian woman's first challenge was surviving her own home. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and the degree to which whatever happened to these girls, or why, how they ended up dying, which your book obviously gets into, why what you say about the Indian woman's first challenge being surviving her first home is so central to the.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go on.
Sorry. Look, these kids were loved. Okay, I mean, there is just no argument there. They were adored by their mothers and fathers, by their cousins, by their uncles. They had many friends. Their teachers thought of them fondly. They were very valued members of their community. I mean, everybody knew what their likes and dislikes were. Everybody knew which class they were in. Everyone knew that the two girls who were first cousins were also best friends, and they would therefore be referred to as Padma, Lalli, as though they were one person rather than two. So they were loved. But you can love somebody and you can still hold them captive. You can love somebody and still not allow them the freedom to make their own choices, or even, in fact, the freedom to say no. And I think that a lot of the troubles that these children faced were similar to what their mothers faced, in the sense that they had a little bit of freedom, but not enough to really make anything of their lives, not enough to even find out who they were. And whatever hopes and dreams they might have had, they had them understanding fully well that, they would not be realized because those decisions were not up to them. Now, the problem is this might have worked in an earlier generation, the issue is rather, but it doesn't work any longer, because women do have a sense now that there are different ways of living, and naturally they want those ways of living. The fact that Padma and Lalli had a phone, the fact that they could call and text, and Padma was even allowed to travel a little bit on her own, to visit family, which is something that her mother would never have been allowed at her age. So it was almost like they had a little bit of freedom and they were told, you have to be satisfied with it. But that is, of course, not how it works. And when they tried to ask for more, to sort of push the boundaries a little bit, it caused disturbances. It caused not just unpleasantness, it led to fear, and it led to anger, and it led to the sense that, they were being ungrateful and they had forgotten their place. And what was expected of them was that they should just be as they were and do as they're told. But that's not what it was like in reality. And so just, being loved and being controlled are two things that can happen simultaneously. And because they pushed against those controls, I think they face the consequences as a result.
there are a lot of questions here sort of about your reporting, and so we can turn to some of those. So someone was just curious, did you ever feel threatened at all while investigating the story?
No, I didn't. I didn't. No.
Carolyn M asks, you talk a lot about where how the girls were limited by where they grew up, and was curious about how you kind of approached writing about the setting, which I guess you had not spent a lot of time there before this case. And the same person asks, you also mentioned the apathy towards the case on a local level was what disturbed you most. Can you talk a little bit about that? So maybe you can talk a little bit more about Katra and how you approached writing about it and the attitude of people there towards the case.
Yeah, so I have reported from Uttar Pradesh prior to this incident. I'd actually written a story for Harper's about this dad whose two kids think they are getting a part-time job in a brick kiln and are really excited to get this job, only to find out that the brick kiln is in Nepal and they are not coming home anytime soon. And the dad goes to the cops and they say, well, there's nothing we can do. So he actually ends up hunting for them, and he goes on this crazy adventure looking for his children and gets them back. And that is Uttar Pradesh for you in a nutshell. Kids ending up trafficked, nobody caring, and people having to really just play the role of detective themselves. So I was not surprised with the situation in Katra, but I think what was surprising for me was that once the media got involved and the politicians started descending on the village, politicians from all the major parties and all the top politicians who even viewers will be familiar with, the investigation got the best treatment that is possible. The best investigators, the best scientists, the best doctors, the best of everything. And it still wasn't entirely competent. Even in the ultimate investigation, there were significant failures, which I think is just so tragic.
Someone is curious if you see any similarities between this case and the Arashi Talwar case, which was another unsolved murder in Uttar Pradesh, actually, from, I guess, 5 or 6 years before. Did you see any similarities between those two cases, or was that something that you looked back on, or not so much?
In the Arashi Talwar case, when Arashi, who was, I believe, 14 at the time, was found dead in her bedroom by her parents, the police were immediately called, and the police showed up in their typical bumbling fashion and, sort of started investigating the case and doing whatever it is that they thought one does in order to investigate the case, and all the while not realizing that there was another dead body in the building, the body of the gentleman who worked for the Talwar family. So, the fact that they didn't even know about the absence of a critical member of the family, didn't know that he was right there on the terrace, his body spoiling in the sun, says everything that you need to know about how the police at a local level tend to conduct investigations. And in this case, in the Arashi Talwar case, as you would know, the Arashi belonged to a middle-class family. Her parents were dentists and relatively well-off, and they would have received the best possible treatment that one can receive in India in circumstances like this. And they were still left ultimately not only not knowing what had happened, but getting implicated in the death themselves. So in that sense of, nobody knows what to do, and nothing is ever sure. No conclusion is ever definite. I mean, I feel like, there are definitely similarities.
I want to ask just sort of about the political angle to this, and sort of in two ways. The first is that, these girls in this case were found in May 2014, which was, I guess, the same month that Narendra Modi's election results as the prime minister, his first election, were announced. And on a sort of smaller scale, the book functions as a critique of politicians who involve themselves in this case. And so I'm wondering sort of twofold. One is the degree to which you wanted your book to function as a critique of the politicians who involve themselves and politics in India. And then more broadly, if you saw the book as sort of commenting in some way on the current era that we're in India right now. So yeah, two-part question.
Prime Minister Modi was sworn in the day before the children were found, and had in fact made the safety of women a very prominent part of his general election campaign. There was a study that showed that the Bharatiya Janata Party, the hardline Hindu party of Mr. Modi, had never discussed the safety of women in such detail as they had in that particular general election. And the fact, one of the reasons they had done it was because, it had become a global issue spoken of in terms of an epidemic. And certain countries, certain governments, such as that of the United Kingdom, were warning women about traveling in India. So Mr. Modi talked about it in great detail. And because he was the first major leader in India to use social media rather than the traditional media to talk about things and to, to communicate, there was this expectation, fairly enough, that this headline crime, the first major crime that took place during his tenure, and certainly the largest one since the 2012 Delhi bus rape, would elicit a response from him. And it didn't. There was, I combed through all of his social media, and he talked about World Environment Day and Putin, and I think organic farming and a host of things, on and on, day after day, week after week, but there was no mention of these children. And it was impossible for him to have missed it because everybody was talking about it. It was a national obsession. So I think the first lesson that we learned was, Prime Minister Modi was no different from earlier politicians, and that he used this incredibly emotive subject of women's safety to win votes, and to win, the votes from women. But actually, when the time came for him to do anything about it, it just didn't interest him. And I think we've continued to see them. There's a lack of interest in not just safety of women, but I think in the conditions of people in general. It's not just anything, it just doesn't interest him. And I think in that he is unique because, he won't even engage in any way. It is almost like it is not part of the world that he inhabits. And of course, we've seen since then many more terrible crimes. And Uttar Pradesh right now is seeing a spate of crimes that that the media is not being allowed to talk about. We've had recently a large rape that journalists who reported about it found themselves hounded by the police and really just thrown out of the state. So the situation is much worse now, where we are sort of receding to an earlier time when we can't talk about these things, which is a huge change,
A couple questions here about working on the book. Someone asks, how long did you work on the book and how did it affect you emotionally? I can answer that question as your friend, but I'll let you answer it.
I started working on it in 2014 in the sense that I just tried to understand what was happening, but I didn't go to Katra until a year later, around the first anniversary of the children's deaths. The last time I went there was in 2018. So the reporting was from 2014 to 2018. And I think, the initial 2 years were frustrating because of the lack of real information. As I show in the book, the parents completely understandably were determined to to receive justice, but it just so happened that their idea of justice meant that they made certain ill-advised decisions. And, once they had made those choices, they couldn't talk about them. And so there were occasions where, they were unwilling to talk about certain quite important things regarding, crucial evidence. And so when I came up upon those walls, it was a struggle. And it just, in a sense, it's quite standard because, all that really means is that if somebody's not talking to you, you just talk to the people around them. So it just meant that my canvas kept getting bigger and bigger. And so, I was traveling beyond Katra to many villages and to districts in different parts of the state. And because Uttar Pradesh is massive, it's the size of a medium country. It's got about 200 million people. So I think that was also a factor. But how was I to you?
Well, I don't know. You were very affected by it, and it took up a lot of your mental space, I would say.
Oh, okay. I have, for my own well-being, I have forgotten all that. That is how I process things like that.
Good answer. Someone asks about your previous book, which was called Beautiful Thing, which I also recommend people get, which is an amazing book about Bombay, actually, and asks, from your first book, one of your major subjects has been the precariousness of women's existence. Does it feel different now from when you wrote Beautiful Thing?
And Beautiful Thing was such a different book because, it came from, it was rooted in this rather extraordinary community. There was a community of women who had faced marginalization and struggle in whichever part of the country they originated from, but had come to Bombay seeking freedom and seeking independence. That meant for them, because of their lack of skills and their lack of education, dancing in bars. And from the outside, it might have seemed like a tragic choice and an unfortunate choice. But for a lot of them, that was the most free and the most independent they had ever been. And it was a wonderful thing for them. It was despite all the struggles and challenges, it was wonderful. And so there was a sort of an element of joy in that. And of course, that's not why I wrote the book, though. I wrote the book because the state government, and this is something that Indian governments tend to do, decided to divert attention from the state's sinking economy to questions of morality, and said that, look, this is immoral. Dance bars are immoral, and let's get rid of them, and essentially threw out about 70,000 women from their jobs. That's why I wrote the book. But there was joy in that book. And I think, even with the good girls, obviously at the core of the good girls, there's love, right? The kids were loved and they loved their parents. And there are those redeeming factors. But I feel like the kids and the good girls never had a chance to be completely free. And I feel like that is sort of what is happening in India today. There were these years when we had our economic boom, when women were experiencing freedom in a way that we never had. And now, because of a combination of circumstances that are very, very troubling, all of those windows and those doors are being slammed shut again. And the situation is extremely stifling once more for women. There is a certain joylessness that you feel is settling into the lives of girls and women.
Yeah. You also say in the book about your own time in Delhi, you say it was an exciting period full of dreams and opportunities, was tarnished by the behavior of men. And, so obviously that was from an earlier period. So a lot of these things have been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one thing about the book itself, for people who haven't read it, which is just, and I'm curious about, the book is not really structured like most nonfiction's books, I would say. It jumps around in terms of its perspective. There are a lot of extremely short chapters. It does not feel to me like a very long magazine article or the type of long form journalism which you obviously write a lot and do expertly. It feels like you maybe wanted to sort of structure the book narratively a little different. Is that so? And why did you decide to do that? Because it does feel unique in that sense.
I wanted to maintain the momentum of the book. That was really important. It's something that I think about all the time because of the subjects that I write about, right? I mean, when you write about violence against women, you are writing or about poverty, these are, and this is a story about both things, right? This is about what it is to be poor, what it is to be a woman. I mean, these are two subjects that people on the one hand feel like they know everything about, and on the other hand, they're like, I don't know as much as I should, but I also don't want to because, life is hard enough and we don't want to take this additional burden on. So I'm always thinking about structure and momentum in a way to persuade people to continue reading and to not stop. And so I didn't plan those short chapters. When I finally got the proofs of the book, I was really startled to see that some of the chapters were I think 2 pages long. But it really was to create that momentum, to stop you from stopping, but also to balance all the stuff that's happening, right? Because there are these search parties that go looking for the kids. There's one search party, then there's another, and then there's the police. And it's like, in a way, everybody is involved, but nobody took responsibility. And therefore, you have all of these conflicting narratives. And part of the challenge was also to streamline everything. And that's also something that I thought a lot about, how to make it just completely clear for people, even though actually for the first few years, it was not at all clear to me.
Just one more question, and then I think we're getting close to wrapping up. But something you alluded to early on was about sanitation and about sort of the women being forced to put themselves in precarious situations by going out to use the toilet. And can you talk about that aspect of these girls' lives and the importance of it to the story you wanted to tell?
Yeah. So, like I said, the absence of toilets became a huge talking point in the aftermath of the children's deaths, right? As in, if we had a better government and there would have been toilets in the village and the girls would not have had to go out in the darkness. I mean, first of all, the question is that why is going out in the dark once the sun is set considered such a threat? That's actually the first question we need to answer. I grew up in Delhi and I still don't like going out in the dark. I just don't, because for me, it is a dreadful thing. And I can imagine, and I do understand why kids in a village far away would feel that fear, and their parents would also feel that fear. But actually, that is the problem, right? The toilets are secondary. The problem is that when the sun sets in a place like India, women are afraid to step out of their house. So let's deal with that. The second issue is that of the toilets. Why didn't they have toilets? And the fact is that this family, of Padma and Lali Shakya's family, they were poor and they did struggle, but also they had land and they could make investments and they could afford a toilet. It's not a cheap thing to have, an outhouse, but they could afford it. They chose not to. And the reason they chose not to was because they believed if you can have something for free, why would you pay for it, right? So that comes from just a lack of education, a lack of saying, look, yes, you can continue using the fields as your toilet, but for various reasons, such as your own health, you should build a toilet in the house. In fact, after the children's deaths, a non-profit swooped down on Katra village and built about 100 outhouses for various village homes. And when I visited, a lot of those outhouses were used for, for protecting the harvest. In the Shakya's outhouse, I opened it one day to use it, and there was a goat sitting inside because it was very hot. And, they wanted the goat to not to feel hot. But that meant that for the time that the goat was in the toilet, nobody could use it. And so they were back to using the fields. So it's a lot of things. It's never simply as straightforward as, well, they should have had a toilet. It's also saying that, why are we so afraid of the darkness? And if we do build you a toilet, why are you so insistent on not using it? And there's also a sense of, well, now you're going to make us use a toilet. What are you going to make us do next? This is how we are. Why are you so insistent on changing us? So really, this is about how we view women and how we view, our rights, but it's also about our culture and the things that we prioritize.
The book is called The Good Girls and Ordinary Killing. You can buy it and many other books at Books and Books, which you should be able to see on your screen, where you can click and buy this and anything else. Books and Books is a great place to support. And this book is incredible. Congratulations, Sonia. And I hope everyone gets a chance to read it.
Isaac, thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
And thank you to both of you. Thank you, Sonia, for bringing us the story of Padma and Lali. Congratulations on all the great reviews, how well the book is being received. Thank you for pointing out all of those subtle, fascinating connections. And I hope that this book goes on to bring some kind of change. I want to thank you both for joining us today. Thank you, Isaac. That was great. Some great questions, a fascinating conversation. And to everyone watching from everywhere, thank you for joining us during your lunch hour or wherever you are, whatever time it is. And just again, a reminder, if you press the green button, you can order the book from Books and Books. We'll ship it right out to you. And if you're in Miami, please come by any one of our stores and grab a copy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stay well. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.